Daniel hadn't planned on getting into a fight that night, but the second he saw the man grab the woman's wrist and heard her sharp intake of breath, his body moved before his mind even caught up. "Hey!" Daniel's voice cut through the noise of the bar, clear and firm. She said no. The man turned, his grip still locked around her wrist, his face contorted with drunken arrogance. "Mind your business." Daniel took a step closer, his eyes locking onto the woman's. She looked terrified but also determined, like a trapped animal trying to keep its composure. Her dark hair framed delicate features, and despite the fear in her wide brown eyes, there was fire there too. "I'll let go when I feel like it," the man sneered, pulling her closer. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the guy's arm and twisted it just enough to make him let go. The man stumbled back, cursing, but Daniel didn't care. His focus was on her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded quickly, rubbing her wrist where the man had held her. "Yeah, thanks. Let's go." The guy barked at her, his face red with anger. "She's not going anywhere with you," Daniel said, stepping between them. His tone left no room for argument. The guy gave him a long, assessing look, then scoffed. "Whatever. Not worth it." He turned and stalked off, disappearing into the crowd. The woman exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier now. He wouldn't take no for an answer. Daniel shook his head. "You don't have to explain. Some guys don't know how to respect boundaries." She glanced down at her wrist, then back up at him. "I'm Paige." "Daniel." For a moment, they just stood there, the noise of the bar fading into the background. Then she smiled, small but real. "I should probably get going," she said. Daniel hesitated. He wanted to make sure she got home safe, but he didn't want to come across as pushy. "Do you have someone waiting for you?" he asked. She shook her head. "I was here with coworkers, but they left early." He pulled out his wallet and handed her a 20. "Take a cab, please." Paige looked at the bill, then back at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he interrupted, "but I'd feel better." She studied him for a second, then took the money. "You're a good guy, Daniel." He shrugged. "Just doing what anyone should." She smiled again, this time a little brighter. "Well, thank you. Really." And then she was gone, disappearing out the door into the night. Daniel didn't think he'd ever see her again. He had no idea that one day he'd be standing beside her at the altar. Daniel hadn't thought much about that night at the bar after it happened. It was just one of those moments, something you did because it was the right thing to do, and then life moved on. But life had a strange way of circling back when you least expected it. It was nearly a year later when he saw her again. He had just stepped into a coffee shop, shaking off the autumn chill, when his eyes landed on a familiar face behind the counter. She was laughing at something a coworker had said, her dark hair now pulled into a messy bun, her eyes bright with amusement. Paige. For a second, he wasn't sure if he should say anything. Maybe she wouldn't even remember him. But then she turned, caught his gaze, and the recognition was instant. Her expression shifted from surprise to something softer, something almost grateful. "You," she said as he stepped forward in line. Daniel let out a small breath of disbelief. "Paige." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I never got to pay you back for that cab fare." He chuckled. "I told you that wasn't necessary." "Still," she mused, glancing at the register. "How about I cover your coffee instead? That I can accept." She smiled as she punched in his order, moving with practiced ease. "You come here often?" "First time." He took in the warm atmosphere, the scent of espresso filling the air. "Guess I should have found this place sooner." Paige slid a cup toward him once it was ready, her fingers brushing his just briefly. "Well, welcome. I work here most mornings." Daniel took a sip, appreciating the rich, bold flavor. "Then I guess I'll be coming back." She didn't look away as she responded, her voice quieter now. "I wouldn't mind that." It was strange, this sudden reconnection. They had been strangers that night, bound only by circumstance. And yet, standing here now, it felt like something unfinished had just found its way back to them. Daniel didn't believe in fate, not really. But as he walked out of the shop that morning, He couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, some things were meant to come back around. Daniel hadn't intended for it to become a routine, but somehow it did. Every morning, he found himself at the coffee shop, always around the same time, always leaving with a cup in his hand and a conversation with Paige lingering in his mind. Their exchanges were effortless, a rhythm they fell into without thinking. Some days, she teased him about his predictable order. Other times, he asked about the book she had tucked beside the register, or she told him funny stories about the customers she dealt with. Slowly, those 5-minute interactions turned into something more. One evening, when he passed by the shop after work, he saw her sitting by the window, her apron folded on the table beside her, a notebook open in front of her. She was chewing on the end of her pen, lost in thought. Before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped inside. She looked up, her surprise turning quickly into something warmer. "Didn't expect to see you at night. Didn't expect to be here," he admitted. "But I saw you and figured I'd say hi." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Well, now you're here. You might as well sit." He did. "What are you working on?" She glanced down at her notes. "Grad school applications." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know you were planning on going back to school." She sighed, tapping her pen against the table. "It's one of those things I keep pushing off. I've been working full-time, saving up. But if I don't do it soon, I feel like I never will." "What are you studying?" "Social work." He nodded, taking that in. "That makes sense." She laughed lightly. "You say that like you've known me forever." "I know enough," he said simply. There was a pause, one of those silences that didn't feel awkward, just full. Paige looked at him for a long moment, as if she were measuring something. Finally, she closed her notebook. "What about you? What about me?" She leaned forward slightly. "What do you do when you're not drinking an absurd amount of coffee?" He chuckled. "I work in construction." That seemed to surprise her. "Really?" He nodded. "I run a small business. Mostly renovations, some new builds. It's not glamorous, but I like it." She considered that. "That actually suits you." Now it was his turn to be curious. "Why do you say that?" She shrugged. "You seem like the type of person who likes making things better. Fixing things." Daniel didn't have a response to that, because it was more accurate than he wanted to admit. The conversation shifted after that, moving from work to childhood stories to favorite movies. They talked like old friends, like two people who had somehow already known each other before they had even met. By the time he finally left, the shop was closing, and Paige was locking up behind him. As they stood outside, the streetlights casting a soft glow, she hesitated. Then, before he could say goodnight, she reached out, a light touch on his wrist. "I'm glad you came in tonight," she said softly. Daniel didn't know why, but those words settled deep in his chest. "Me too," he admitted. Then, with a small nod, she turned and walked away. And Daniel knew, without question, that this wasn't the end of whatever was happening between them. It was only the beginning. The first time Daniel kissed Paige, it wasn't planned. It wasn't slow or calculated. It was a moment crashing into them like a wave neither of them had seen coming. It happened on a cold November night after one of their now regular meetups at the coffee shop. The place had closed and they had walked together down the quiet streets, their breath visible in the crisp air. Paige had been talking about her grad school application. Her voice filled with nerves, excitement, and something else, something unspoken but present between them. Then she stopped walking. Daniel turned to look at her, the street lamp casting a soft glow around them. Her expression was unreadable, thoughtful, hesitant. "I keep wondering," she murmured, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag, "if I'm making the right choices, if I'm just chasing something because I think I should, not because I really want it." He studied her for a moment, then said, "I think the fact that you care so much about getting it right means you're already on the right path." She exhaled, a small puff of air in the cold. "You always say things like that." "Like what?" "Like you know exactly what to say to make things feel less overwhelming." Daniel took a step closer, instinct guiding him. "Maybe it's because I mean them." Paige lifted her gaze, her dark eyes searching his. The space between them was small, shrinking by the second. Neither of them moved away. You're not just someone I see in the mornings anymore, she whispered. The words hit him like a rush of warmth against the cold. I know, he said. And then, as if the answer had been inevitable all along, he kissed her. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss that felt like stepping over a line they both knew had been waiting for them. Paige responded instantly, her fingers curling into the front of his jacket, pulling him closer. The world around them, the distant hum of traffic, the scattered glow of streetlights faded into nothing. When they finally pulled apart, her breath was uneven, her eyes still closed for a second longer than necessary. Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his voice low. I've wanted to do that for a while. She let out a small, breathless laugh. Me too. And just like that, something shifted between them, something that had been building for months, finally acknowledged. They didn't rush into labels or declarations, but the next time he walked her home, his hand found hers without hesitation. And she didn't let go. The first time Daniel realized he was in love with Paige, it wasn't some grand, cinematic moment. It wasn't a whispered confession under the stars or an earth-shattering realization. It was a quiet, unassuming afternoon in her tiny apartment with the smell of freshly brewed tea filling the air and a record softly playing in the background. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through old papers, occasionally muttering to herself about what to keep and what to toss. Her hair was piled in a loose bun, strands falling free around her face, and she was wearing a sweater that was at least 2 sizes too big for her. Daniel had been helping, though he used the term loosely. Mostly, he just watched her, amused by the way she got completely absorbed in the task. At one point, she held up an old birthday card, her lips curving as she read it. Then she turned to him, her expression soft. My grandmother used to send me handwritten letters every month, she said. Even when I was little. She said it was important to hold on to words that mattered. Daniel had never been particularly sentimental, but something about the way she said it, the way she held the card like it was something sacred, hit him in a way he wasn't expecting. And just like that, the thought settled into his chest, solid and undeniable. He was in love with her. It wasn't something that had happened suddenly. It had been building, piece by piece, in the quiet moments between them. In the way she listened when he spoke, like his words carried weight. In the way she reached for his hand absent-mindedly, as if it was second nature. In the way she made even the simplest things feel like they mattered. He didn't say anything that day. He wasn't sure if he was ready, or if she was, and he didn't want to rush something that felt so steady, so right. But the feeling didn't go away. And with every passing day, it only grew stronger. The first time they fought, it wasn't about anything big. It started with something small, Paige canceling last minute on dinner plans because she had to work late. Daniel had told her it was fine, and he meant it. But then it happened again. And again. At first, he let it go. He knew she was balancing a lot, her job, her grad school applications, everything in between. But as the cancellations piled up, so did the frustration. One evening, when she sent another hurried apology text, he found himself at her doorstep instead of just accepting it. She opened the door, surprised, her hair still damp from a shower. I wasn't expecting you, she said. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. Yeah, I figured. Paige frowned slightly, stepping aside to let him in. Is something wrong? He hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. You tell me. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. What do you mean? He sighed, crossing his arms. Paige, I get it. You're busy. You have a lot on your plate. But I'm starting to feel like, he stopped himself, trying to find the right words. Like I'm always the last thing on your list. Her features tightened. That's not fair. Isn't it? He exhaled through his nose, trying to keep his voice even. I don't need to be your priority all the time. I just need to feel like I matter. Paige's shoulders tensed, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, quietly, she admitted, I'm scared. Daniel frowned. Of what? She hesitated, then looked at him, her expression raw. Of getting too comfortable. Of letting myself lean on you too much. Because every time I've done that before, it hasn't ended well. Something in his chest ached at that. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I'm not them, Paige. I know that, she whispered. But knowing it and believing it are two different things. Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Then let me prove it to you. She looked down at their hands, exhaling slowly. Then, after a long moment, she squeezed his fingers. Okay, she said. And just like that, the tension eased. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough. Months passed, and things between them only deepened. Paige got into grad school. Daniel's business expanded. Their lives grew busier, but they always found time for each other. Then, one evening, as they stood in his kitchen cooking dinner, she turned to him out of nowhere and said, "I love you." Daniel froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the chest. She didn't look nervous. She wasn't hesitant. She just said it, simple and sure, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Because he had loved her for so long that saying it out loud felt less like a confession and more like a truth that had always existed between them. He put down the spoon he was holding, stepped toward her, and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you too," he murmured. Her eyes shone, and she leaned into his touch. And in that moment, Daniel knew this was it. This was the woman he was meant to be with. This was the love he had been waiting for. Daniel had never believed in fate, but standing in front of Paige now, he wondered if maybe some things were always meant to be. The evening air was thick with the scent of rain, the streets glistening under the soft glow of streetlights. They had stepped outside after dinner at her place, their conversation lingering between them like an unfinished sentence. Paige stood in front of him, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. She had been quiet all night, her usual ease replaced with something heavier. He could see it in the way she kept tucking her hair behind her ear, a nervous habit she rarely indulged. Finally he spoke. "Something's on your mind." Paige let out a breath, nodding. "Yeah." He waited, giving her the space to find the words. She looked up at him, something vulnerable in her gaze. "Grad school starts soon. And I've been thinking about what that means for us." His stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Okay. I don't want to lose this," she said firmly. "I don't want to lose us. But I also don't want to hold either of us back." Daniel frowned, stepping closer. "Paige, what are you saying?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. I guess I'm just scared. Scared of what happens when life gets even busier, when things get harder. What if we start to drift without realizing it?" Daniel reached for her hands, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. "Then we fight to stay close." She exhaled, her fingers tightening around his. "I know it won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is," he murmured. Paige searched his face like she was trying to memorize him, trying to etch this moment into her memory. Then, after a beat, she nodded. "You're right," she whispered. He smiled, relief washing through him. "I usually am." She laughed, shaking her head. "You'd be unbearable if you weren't so damn lovable." Daniel pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Does this mean you're done doubting us?" She rested her forehead against his chest, her voice soft. "Yeah, I am." And just like that, the weight between them lifted. Days turned into weeks, and life shifted as Paige started school. Her schedule was packed, her days long, but they made it work. They found their rhythm in the in-between moments, in stolen mornings over coffee, in late-night phone calls that stretched until dawn, in the comfort of knowing that no matter how chaotic life became, they were in it together. Daniel had never been the type to believe in forever, but with her, it didn't feel like a concept. It felt like a promise. One evening, as they lay on her couch, Paige curled against his side, he felt the words forming before he even realized they were there. "Marry me." It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It was just truth, slipping out before he could stop it. Paige went still. Then, slowly, she sat up, looking at him with wide eyes. "What did you just say?" Daniel didn't back down. Didn't try to take it back. He reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. "Marry me," he repeated, steady and sure. "Not tomorrow. Not next week. But someday. When you're ready. When it feels right. Just tell me that's where we're heading." Tears welled in her eyes, her lips parting in surprise. Then, with a shaky breath, she nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "That's where we're heading." Daniel felt something settle inside him, something deep and certain. He kissed her then, slow and deliberate, sealing the promise between them. And in that moment, he knew whatever came next, they would face it together. Always.